This is DigiStats. I've recently been sharing a lot of graphs on the Digimon TCG Facebook page, and as well as a couple of Discord channels. After talking to a few people and some content creators, I was really encouraged to post some of the data that I've been collecting and kind of go over it with y'all. A few of these you've already seen it either on the Discord or the Facebook page, but I'll be going over the data in more detail, as well as talking about how it relates to some other trends in the BT8 and EX2 meta. For this video, this is mostly going to focus on just the North American region. But in the future, I'd like to kind of go over other regions, as well as showing the kind of a comparison between either Japan and North America and various regions to kind of show how the meta is different in different places. This is my first video, so welcome any feedback, and feel free to leave me any feedback in the comments on how I can improve these videos in the future. So the very first thing I want to go over is the BT8 and EX2 tier list. So with this, this tier list is based more so on statistical results than my own opinion. To begin, it's easy to say that in BT7, Blue Hybrid was a tier 0 deck because it had 58% of the top 16s. Normally, it needs at least 60% to be classified as a tier 0 deck, but I feel like we can round the 58% up to 60 and still have a strong case for it. So later on, I'm going to go over why I think it's still tier 0 in BT8 and EX2. But for the rest of these, as you can see, in tier 1, I have Yellow Hybrid, Mastermind, and Imperial. Then there's Red Hybrid, Beelstar, and Green Hybrid as tier 1.5 decks. That's followed up by Blackwork Greymon and Armor Rush as tier 2 decks. And then kind of in this row category, I have Cherubi, Security Control, and X Antibody. This first graph that I want to go over is one that you may have already seen on the Digimon TCG Facebook page or in some of the Digimon community discords. This shows all the top 16 decks for BT and EX2 from major tournaments. For the purpose of my analysis, any tournament with over 120 players is considered a major tournament. As you can see, Imperial was the deck with the most top 16s in the BT8 and EX2 format. That's followed closely by Blue Hybrid, and then kind of rounding off the third place was Yellow Hybrid. As I'll show later, Imperial is one of the most popular decks in this format, so it's reasonable to see it as one of the top decks in this format. What I kind of believe is most telling about this particular graph is that both the top decks were blue decks. And if we take a look at this next graph, it shows the percentage of top 16 decks based on the color of the deck. For this analysis, if a deck didn't contain at least 33%, so 1/3, of the deck wasn't a particular color, it was not labeled as containing that color. So, for example, Imperial usually only has 4 to 5 green cards, and if you include the multicolor cards, it's typically only around 30%. Where Mastermind, for instance, has an average of either 40% with yellow or purple, depending on kind of how the deck is built. But in either case, regardless of how the deck is built, it still contains at least 40% of another color. Additionally, I want to point out that I separated Red and Yellow Hybrid from Yellow Hybrid because it ran more like a security control deck than as a Yellow Hybrid deck. But if you feel like this should be labeled as yellow, you can just add that 2% here to the yellow percentage, which would make it about 21% total. As you can see, Blue had 48% of the top 16s in this format, which, if you've seen some of my other graphs for BT7, you know that blue was dominant in that format. And I think it's easy to say that even without graph that we know that Gabu Bond was the top deck in BT6. So for at least 3 formats now, blue has been the top performing color. So with this next graph, it shows the performance of a deck in top 16s throughout the format. So tournament weekends were combined together. That allowed the graph to be easier to read and kind of showcases the data better. So you can see with this first tournament, yellow was clearly the top performing deck. And then they kind of continue with this 12 to 9 range for a while. And you see also Imperial as this kind of contender. These are the 2 top contending decks of the early part of the format. But as the format goes on, you see yellow have this sharp decline. And the same with Imperial at the same time. The corresponding thing that goes on at this time is that blue hybrid starts taking more and more of the matches. And as blue hybrid begins to top more tournaments, all the other decks fall to very minimal numbers. So a lot of this data is going to be going over just how strong decks are and what may have been top performing decks based on popularity. So if we look at popularity, we're going to look at this data. Now, this isn't from major tournaments. This is based off all the metadata I could find. So this includes locals, online tournaments, tournaments that don't have 120 players, some of the tournaments that had more than 120 players. And so this is kind of the percentages of decks in that tournament. So as you can see, Imperial was the most popular deck of the format with about 18%. And then that's followed closely with about 13% being Mastamon. So if we switch discussion to Mastamon for just a moment, you can see that Mastamon was the second most popular deck in the format overall, but didn't perform as well as some of the other decks. So if we examine some of the data, it's likely often due to that a deck tied often in comparison to other decks. In EX2, for example, Mastamon had more ties than any other deck in the format. But I also want to look at how your locals may differ from major tournaments. So at this, this is an example from Mario's Gaming World Circuit Season 2. Here you have that Mastamon is the best performing deck. And then you've got Imperial as a second with around 23%. I will say with Imperial, majority of the analysis I ran found that Imperial popularity ranged from anywhere from 20 to 40%. And also had about 20 to 40% of the wins. So you kind of see a strong correlation between popularity and performance with Imperial. But the main reason I wanted to go over this data is because it's clear that your local meta may have a deck that's really dominant, but that isn't showing a true reflection of a deck's strengths, weaknesses, or statistics for the overall format. So it's important to remember, just because you have a deck that's dominating your local tournaments, it doesn't mean that it's actually the best deck. So if we go back to popularity real quick, this shows the popularity decks through time at Mario tournaments, along with some couple of other tournaments that I've thrown in. With, in this case, 1 being the oldest and 7 being the latest tournament that was played. As you can see, yellow's popularity remained relatively the same throughout the entire format. You have a small dip here. And while these tournaments usually had about 35 to 50 players, if you wanted to compound these into the tournaments that had, 150 to 500 players, these ratios stay relatively the same. So the graph really shows a true representation of what you may be experiencing at a large tournament. You also see that kind of throughout that Imperial stayed a popular deck throughout the format, which is this lighter blue coloration here. But what I think is most informative about this particular graph is how popular Blue Hybrid got as the format went on. So if you see this dotted line here, this shows a linear progression of popularity with Blue Hybrid. Now, I personally believe that this trend would have continued, and you would have kept seeing Blue Hybrid get more popular to a certain plateau effect if the format continued. So if we correspond this back to one of the graphs I showed earlier, you can see there's a strong correlation between as Blue Hybrid got more popular, the deck won more and more, and all the other decks in the format clearly just fell off. Now, there's two important things to remember with this. People will say, well, that's because the Imperial and Yellow Hybrid players all just switched to Blue Hybrid. Well, if we look at this last graph again, you can see that those numbers, while they dwindled a little bit, this shows that just different players were picking up Blue Hybrid, not just top performers that just switched to Blue Hybrid from another color. So to me, what that shows is that Blue Hybrid was so strong that even skilled players with another deck still couldn't keep up with Blue Hybrid of even against someone who was even lower skill level as far as performance in major tournaments goes. And so you have this relationship to where Blue Hybrid may have been picked up by people that may usually get top 64, but because they're piloting Blue Hybrid now, they can get a top 16. And it really showcases how strong the deck is. So for those reasons there, I classified Blue Hybrid as a tier 0 deck. It clearly, at the end of the format, had over 60% of the top 16s. And that's a trend that I think would have continued if the format would have gone on, because it would have stayed at least as popular as it was. There's two other aspects that I'd like to go over. And one is that Red Hybrid is one of the best performing decks based on popularity, with Mastamon being one of the worst. Once again, this tier list isn't based off how strong I think a deck is, but it's based off the results of a top 16. Now, if you want my personal opinion, after looking at all this data, I think the data shows that Red Hybrid and Armor Rush are much stronger decks than people thought, but neither had enough people playing them, or at least not the top skilled players, to really showcase what the decks were capable of. Now, the next portion of this video, I want to go over the restrictions from Bandai on Tommy and JetSilphy and what the data shows and why it likely happened. So earlier I presented graphs showing the top 16 in major tournaments, but now I really want to show just the decks that were first, the first place decks. So this first slide shows the number of first place decks in BT8 and EX2. As you can see, Blue Hybrid and Yellow Hybrid were a vast majority of the winners. Both of these are BT7 decks that hold the number 1 and number 2 spot. Just to show this again, Blue Hybrid was 40% of all the first place decks, with Yellow Hybrid being 38%. So just for fun and kind of for sadness, let's add all the hybrid decks together. 92%. 92% of the first place decks in BT8 and EX2 format were hybrids. That is insane. This alone should show that hybrid needed some type of nerf so that other decks could have performed well in the format. Personally, I have no issues with hybrid decks being in the top 16s. Into similar numbers that red and green hybrid were getting, where you're seeing, maybe 2 to 4 of the top decks are a hybrid, or even 2 to 6 of the top decks are a hybrid deck. But I think it's definitely telling that 92% of the first place decks were hybrids. To clarify, this 8% here is one tournament that a Mastermind deck won. That is it. Just one tournament. So just for fun, I ran some predictive analysis on BT8 and EX2 format about what it would have looked like if we had seen the Tommy and JetSilphy bans at the beginning of the format. For the analysis, I removed any decks that either played Tommy or JetSilphy. So it's not possible to know exactly how well blue hybrid or yellow hybrid would have performed in the format. Imperial would have likely been the dominant deck of the format, both because of its strength of being a blue deck and the popularity of the deck. If we look at colors, we can see that blue would still have had the highest percentage of top 16s. But in my predictive analysis, there was a few things I added. So popularity of the deck, how well the deck performed, how well the deck performed versus blue hybrid and yellow hybrid were particularly important because if those two decks weren't as strong, these other decks that often lost to them would have likely performed better. So because of this, you can see that Mastermind became a 15% of the top 16s. And the reasons for this is that Mastermind often lost to blue hybrid or tied yellow hybrid. So if those two decks were gone, the Mastermind could have really popped off in this format. The other notable statistics I'd like to point out is yellow became the worst performing color. So looking through all the data, the other yellow decks, such as like Sakuyamon from BT8 and EX2, did very poorly. And the only decks that did well was an occasional Lord Nightmon deck in this predictive analysis. Now, yellow hybrid could have done better, but because JetSilphy was such a staple of every yellow hybrid, I couldn't run any type of accurate predictive analysis on it. So who knows how the deck would have performed, how the color would have performed. The other thing is I want to point out that black here, and so this is black X antibody, remained relatively the same. Throughout BT8 and EX2, it was often to see a one X antibody deck in the top 16. And this would have remained relatively the same in this format. And of course, we know these are going to change with BT9 and all the bonuses it's getting. So yeah, so that is the BT8 and EX2 meta. Now, particularly in North America only, I'm going to try to do regular updates with this in the future as we continue through BT9, and hopefully it paints a more accurate picture of what the meta looks like. But I'm also going to go into depth on statistically how well other decks are going against particular decks, because it's one thing if someone says, oh, yellow hybrid always counters blue hybrid, but if the data is showing something different, maybe it's worth looking at the statistics and seeing what decks are actually performing better versus a particular deck. And that's one thing I really want to bring forward in these future videos. So I really appreciate y'all stopping by. And if you have any comments or anything like that, please leave them for me so that I can get kind of better feedback as I try to get better with this. Also, if you're a tournament organizer, I'd really appreciate getting with you, either like online locals or major events, so that I can create a bigger database for Digimon TCG, and with that, can more accurately show what's going on in North America for our meta and kind of let the community see what's really going on statistically. So thanks again. Thanks for kind of making it through this video and watching the thing. I hope y'all enjoyed it. Please feel free to leave any comments if y'all have any feedback for me. Thank y'all.